In the quiet hills of southwestern Missouri, the evening of August 9, 1861 arrived with a deceptive calm. The summer air hung warm above the fields, and the tall prairie grass bent gently beneath a slow drifting wind. Farmers in the region had already finished their day's labor. Lamps were lit inside wooden homes scattered along the dusty roads. The valley around Wilson's Creek seemed untouched by the terrible storm that had begun tearing the young United States apart. Yet not far from those peaceful farms, thousands of soldiers waited in uneasy silence. The nation was only months into the great conflict now known as the American Civil War, and both sides were still learning what war would demand of them. Many of the men camped in Missouri that night had never fired their rifles in anger. Some had never traveled more than a few miles from home. They had joined armies filled with excitement, patriotism, and uncertainty. Commanding the Union forces in the region was a determined and fiery officer named Nathaniel Lyon. Lyon understood the fragile situation in Missouri. The state was divided in loyalty, with neighbors sometimes standing on opposite sides of the war. Confederate supporters and Southern sympathizers had gathered under the leadership of Sterling Price, whose Missouri State Guard had joined forces with troops under Confederate General Benjamin McCulloch. Together their army greatly outnumbered Lyon's smaller command. Most military officers would have chosen caution. Retreat toward stronger Union territory would have been the safer decision. But Lyon believed delay would allow the Confederates to grow even stronger. If Missouri were to remain under Union control, the enemy must be struck first, and struck quickly. So as darkness settled across the countryside on August 9th, Lyon quietly prepared a daring attack. Campfires were slowly extinguished. Orders passed from officer to officer in low voices so that the sound would not travel across the fields. Soldiers gathered their gear, tightened belts around cartridge boxes, and lifted heavy rifles onto their shoulders. The night sky stretched above them, bright with scattered stars, while the land itself lay wrapped in darkness. Shortly after midnight the Union Army began to move. Columns of blue-coated soldiers marched silently along narrow farm roads and across open pastures. Wagon wheels creaked softly beneath the weight of ammunition and supplies. Horses snorted in the darkness as cavalry units followed behind the marching infantry. Somewhere in the distance a lonely owl called from the trees. For many soldiers the long night march felt endless. Boots struck the ground in steady rhythm while men tried to ignore their rising fear. Some whispered quiet prayers. Others thought of distant homes, of wives, parents, and children who could not possibly imagine the moment that was approaching. Ahead of them, beyond the dark ridges and the drifting mist of the valley, Confederate troops slept beside Wilson's Creek. Their camps stretched across the countryside, tents scattered near the water and beneath the shade of trees. Most believed the Union Army had already begun withdrawing toward Springfield. Few expected danger before morning. But danger was already moving toward them through the night. Lyon's plan was bold and risky. His army would divide into two separate columns. One force would attack from the north, striking the Confederate camps at dawn. Another column would circle around the enemy and attack from the rear. If both attacks struck together, confusion might shatter the larger Confederate army before it could properly organize. As the hours passed, the soldiers marched deeper into the quiet valley. A thin layer of fog settled over the low ground near the creek. The air smelled of damp earth and summer grass. Slowly the eastern horizon began to show the faintest trace of gray light. The men reached a ridge overlooking the valley below. From that height they could see the faint shapes of Confederate camps scattered along the water. Tents appeared like pale shadows in the dim light. A few dying campfires glowed softly among the trees. The ridge where the Union soldiers gathered would soon earn a name remembered in American history: Bloody Hill. Artillery crews pushed heavy cannons into position along the crest. Powder charges were rammed carefully into the gun barrels while officers studied the valley through field glasses. Infantry soldiers knelt behind the artillery line, gripping their muskets and waiting for the signal that would begin the battle. For a moment the world seemed completely silent. Then the command was given. At the first light of dawn on August 10th, the cannons fired. Flames burst from the muzzles, and iron shells screamed down into the Confederate camps below. The sudden explosions shattered the morning calm. Men leapt from their blankets in confusion while officers shouted urgent commands. Before the smoke from the first cannon volley had drifted away, Union infantry surged forward across the ridge. Blue lines of soldiers advanced through the rising fog, their muskets already firing. The quiet valley of Wilson's Creek had become a battlefield. As the sun climbed slowly above the Missouri hills, the valley filled with thunder. Muskets cracked in long rolling volleys. Cannon blasts echoed from ridge to ridge. Smoke from black powder weapons spread across the battlefield until the air itself seemed gray and heavy. Union soldiers held the high ground along Bloody Hill. From that position they fired downward toward Confederate forces scrambling to organize below. Officers rode along the lines shouting commands while drummers beat rapid signals to keep the regiments moving. But the Confederate army quickly recovered from the shock of the surprise attack. Under the direction of Generals Price and McCulloch, Southern troops formed battle lines and began advancing toward the hill. Gray-clad infantry moved through the smoke and tall grass, their rifles raised as they climbed toward the Union position. The first assault struck with fierce determination. Union soldiers waited until the advancing line drew close. Then a sudden volley erupted from the ridge. Dozens of muskets fired together, sending clouds of smoke drifting down the hillside. Confederate soldiers fell in the grass, yet the attack continued forward. Again and again the Southern troops charged uphill. Each time they were met with gunfire from the Union line above them. The noise was deafening. The sharp crack of rifles mixed with the deeper thunder of artillery. Dust and smoke filled the air until soldiers could barely see more than a few yards ahead. Men fired at moving shapes in the haze. Commands were shouted and sometimes lost in the roar of battle. The smell of burned powder hung thick over the hill. In the midst of that chaos rode General Nathaniel Lyon. Earlier in the morning he had already been wounded. A bullet had grazed his leg, and another had struck near his head. Blood stained parts of his uniform, yet he refused to leave the battlefield. Lyon believed his soldiers needed to see their commander standing beside them. So he rode along the front line, encouraging the men and urging them to hold their ground. The fighting grew more desperate with every passing minute. Confederate forces continued to push forward, determined to break the Union position. At times the attackers reached the very crest of the hill before being forced back again by close musket fire. Bodies lay scattered across the grass. Some soldiers crawled away from the line, wounded and desperate for water. Others continued loading and firing their rifles until their hands trembled from exhaustion. By mid-morning the battle had become a brutal struggle of endurance. Ammunition wagons struggled to reach the front. The summer heat grew stronger beneath the rising sun. Many soldiers had been fighting for hours without rest. Then came the moment that would forever shape the memory of the battle. Seeing parts of his line beginning to falter under relentless attack, General Lyon decided to lead a charge personally. Mounting a horse, he rode toward the front of the Union line where the fighting was fiercest. His uniform was dusty and torn, his face pale with fatigue, but his voice rang clearly above the noise of battle. He called for the soldiers to follow him forward. For a brief moment the Union troops surged ahead, inspired by the courage of their commander. Muskets flashed through the smoke as the men pushed back toward the Confederate line. Then a single rifle shot echoed sharply through the haze. The bullet struck Lyon in the chest. He fell from the saddle and collapsed among the soldiers he had come to lead. With his death, Nathaniel Lyon became the first Union general killed in combat during the Civil War. The news spread quickly along the Union lines, bringing both anger and sorrow to the weary soldiers who had fought beside him since dawn. Despite their grief, the battle continued. Confederate attacks pressed harder than ever against the exhausted Union army. Their numbers gradually began to overwhelm the defenders on Bloody Hill. Ammunition grew scarce. Many regiments had already lost large portions of their men. By late morning the Union commanders recognized that the position could no longer be held. Reluctantly the order to withdraw was given. Union soldiers slowly pulled back from the ridge, carrying as many wounded comrades as they could. Others were left lying in the tall grass where the fighting had been fiercest. As the retreat continued, the thunder of cannon fire gradually faded. Confederate troops moved onto the hilltop that had been defended so fiercely for hours. The battle was over. Across the valley, the terrible cost of the fighting became clear. Broken wagons, scattered rifles, torn flags, and hundreds of fallen soldiers marked the ground where the armies had struggled for control. More than 2,500 men had been killed, wounded, or captured during that single day of combat. For the people of Missouri, the Battle of Wilson's Creek was a grim awakening. The war would not be short. It would not be distant. It would reach deep into the lives of ordinary families across the nation. Today the fields around Wilson's Creek are quiet once more. Wind moves softly through the grass where soldiers once stood in battle lines. Birds circle above the same ridges where cannons once roared. Yet history remembers. On that August morning in 1861, beneath the rising sun and the drifting smoke of battle, thousands of Americans faced one another across Bloody Hill. Many never returned home. Their footsteps, their courage, and their sacrifice remain woven into the silent hills of Missouri, where the echoes of that long day still seem to linger in the morning mist.